But let's go back to where we started. In March, we had a hearing on the fiscal state of the nation. I think our witnesses and members alike shared the same sentiment. The fiscal health of our country is in decline. And our deficit spending, which is driving, by the way, a record debt to GDP, and our unfunded liabilities into the future are completely unsustainable. We also agree that both Republicans and Democrats have contributed to this financial mess that we find ourselves in. This isn't a Republican or Democrat problem, it's a math problem, and it will require real leadership from both sides of the aisle before it's too late. No leader worth their salt, in my opinion, could agree with this assessment and not feel an overwhelming sense of urgency and responsibility to address it. And that's what we're going to do today. This is part of that. Whether your concerns for the country are climate change and social safety nets, sustainability, or infrastructure and military readiness, a sovereign debt crisis would put all of these programs in peril. As a backdrop to the introduction of our budget resolution, I think it's noteworthy to reflect on what happened while we were home in August. One of the three major credit rating agencies, Fitch, downgraded the United States credit rating. Fitch stated that their decision to downgrade was due to, quote, fiscal deterioration in the coming years, mainly as a result of soaring interest costs, a weaker economy. They predicted a recession by the end of the year in Q1 of next year, and only a 0.5 percentage point in growth in 2024. But they also mentioned the big debt driver, the structural imbalance in our federal budget, runaway mandatory spending. Fitch also said that our cuts to non-defense, according to the FRA and other agreements, were just modest improvements, and that Congress doesn't have a long-term plan to deal with the real debt drivers of mandatory spending in a meaningful way that will reduce our debt to GDP. Finally, they warned that if we don't address these things, we should expect two things to happen, two consequences. We're going to get further downgraded, or we're going to undermine the dollar as the world's reserve currency. Folks, whether we have a slow economic decline as a result of this massive indebtedness or a sudden economic catastrophe, a sovereign debt crisis will not only jeopardize our economic prosperity, but our security, America's leadership in the world, and worse, our children's future. That's why our founding fathers repeatedly warned about excessive debt. My favorite quote is from our fourth president, James Madison, who said, "A public debt is a public curse." That's part of the title of our budget resolution. That curse, by the way, hangs heavy over our children's heads. It looms large over the horizon of our country. Our budget resolution will reverse the curse by reining in spending, returning to pro-growth policies, and restoring fiscal responsibility here in the nation's capital. This fiscal framework will balance the budget in 10 years by reducing deficit spending by $16 trillion. We achieve this, important to note, without cutting Medicare, Social Security, or veterans' benefits. We believe that the most practical and politically palatable way to fix the insolvency, and that's real, and it's in this 10-year window, and the unsustainability, not only for the seniors today, but for the seniors of tomorrow, is through constructive bipartisan efforts, so we recommend a bipartisan debt commission. Here's the plan for reversing the curse. First, we right-size the bloated bureaucracy by eliminating wasteful and unnecessary discretionary spending. We've seen 40% growth in the government since COVID. CBO says we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars that we wouldn't have otherwise spent coming out of COVID. Next, we reverse the recent $11 trillion record spending spree that has occurred over the last couple of years. We don't need an army of IRS agents. We don't need green energy giveaways. We don't need Obamacare subsidies for the wealthy. Third, these are the debt drivers, the big ones. Reining in runaway mandatory spending through entitlement reforms. We do that by putting patients in charge of their health care, strengthening Medicare for seniors, making Medicaid work rather, for the most vulnerable, and we end cradle-to-grave dependence. Mandatory 70% of the budget, it's 90% of the budget growth over the next 10 years. Fourth, we root out the rampant waste, fraud, and abuse in our entitlement programs. According to GAO, we have upwards of $2 trillion in expense there and in waste over the next 10 years. Lastly, but most importantly, I think, or at least as important, we reignite growth and prosperity with lower taxes, lower regulations, unleashing energy independence, building on America's first trade policies. If we can have 1% growth to the 2% projected by CBO, we add $3 trillion to our efforts to reduce the deficit. We can do that more. By the way, the 80s and 90s, we had over 3% growth, and our 75-year historic average is over 3%. Lastly, we all are committed to fixing the broken budget process. It's not working. It's failing the American people. It's failing this institution. I think there's a bipartisan commitment to do that. President Biden said, show me your budget, I'll show you your priorities. I agree with him, but I think there's a stark difference between our priorities and the president's priorities. In our priorities, we rein in spending in this budget. We reform entitlements. We return to pro-growth policies. We restore fiscal responsibility by balancing the budget. The president, in his budget, imposes the highest levels of taxing, spending, and borrowing in the history of the country. $90 billion in increased spending in discretionary next year, $2.2 trillion in new mandatory spending and more entitlement programs, $4.7 trillion in new taxes. Instead of balancing, his budget adds $17 trillion to the debt over the next 10 years. Let me close here. Today, we lay out this vision for the future of our country, and I don't think the stakes could be any higher. If we demonstrate collectively, Republicans and Democrats, the extraordinary sense of urgency, persistence, and political courage, we will preserve America's leadership in the world and secure the blessings of liberty for our children. But if we don't, we'll be the first of our nation's leaders to leave the next generation with not a better and brighter future, but a worse and weaker country